Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, whoa, that's loud. I'm going to talk about Azure Pentesting today. Hopefully, the demos will work out well. I didn't figure out that there's no network reception here, but I'm hotspotting, so fingers crossed. But let's start off with some few facts, mainly because the few pen testers who I've spoken to in the community, not a lot of people are in Azure pen testing. So this is kind of like an introductory chat or session, mostly to bring the community up to get into Azure pen testing. So it's going to be very high level. I'm going to explain. It's going to be a lot of information and hopefully some few demos if it works. So did you know that cloud data centers account for 3% of the world's energy consumption? That's one fun fact. I don't think that's pretty great, especially with load shedding and all, but we'll leave that for now. Currently, right now, these are all 2022 stats from Gartner, as well as some other leading publications as well. The other one is 50% of the world's corporate data is stored in the cloud. So 90% of the world of the large enterprise have adopted multi-cloud, so that's whether you're in AWS, Azure, GCP as well, within the multi-cloud infrastructure. 100 zettabytes of data is projected by 2025. It's quite big. I'm not sure how many zeros that is, but I know it's very large. And finally, cloud infrastructure services generate about 178 billion. So that is looking, let's say, from AWS and Azure and GCP for the actual housing when you host your infrastructure in the cloud. And in a nutshell, I highly suggest learning cloud security. It's not going anywhere, and what I mean by learning this is if you focus on web application penetration testing or infrastructure penetration testing or mobile, a lot of the clients' pen testing approaches will be occurring within the cloud. So it's always good to start learning cloud pen testing. So as mentioned, my name is Javan, and today is Pentesting Cloud. How? An introduction into Azure pen testing. So yes, Azure, I'm sure you figured, it's another cloud provider. And how it works is that you will have a data center with a whole lot of different racks. On top of the racks, you've got a fabric controller. And what the fabric controller does is, let's say you want to deploy a virtual machine, then it'll then pick, okay, which server rack I should go to. And then you've got the orchestrator, which communicates in line with the API. Everything in the cloud is more or less communicates. It's more or less one large big API. So that packages your API requests, saying, okay, if I want a load balancer or a virtual machine, then the orchestrator will package that and send that to the fabric controller, then deploy that within a server rack. And all of this, the different ways that you can communicate with the API. You can do that through the actual portal. You can do that with CLI clients, things like Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI as well. So before we begin, I would like just to describe some quick terms. So I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with AWS. Within Azure, what the IAM is called RBAC, Role-Based Access Control. And this is an authorization model that is used to assign permissions to security principals. What I mean by security principals, that is users, groups, or service principals as well. And then you've got a service. This is a solution that's provided by Microsoft. So this is basically the application, let's say application platform or compute or something like that. And a resource is actually the individual resource that's deployed by a customer. Then you also have something where it is called a tenant. A tenant, that is, if you're familiar with AWS, can think of that as your root account, kind of to find a similarity for it. And then how it's separated within a tenant, you can then have management groups. So when MTN, for example, let's say MTN has an Azure Cloud instance, there we'll have, let's say, a management group of, let's say, with this is a South African branch, then maybe they'll have another branch maybe for Ghana or something like that. And then you'll have from there different subscriptions. So it's a logical way of organizing your tenant, your identities, your users, groups, or resources which are deployed within your actual environment. It's very big. So, as mentioned, this is an introductory course. I'm not just picking one specific service, but it's kind of like looking, okay, what exactly can be done? What is the best approach to go with terms for cloud pen testing as an introductory? So these are the different areas. This is constantly growing. You've got your security management area, you've got the platform. If you want to go into hybrid, connecting your cloud environment to your on-premise, you've got your infrastructure service, and this is always growing by Microsoft. So for today, how we are going to go about it is we're going to have a hypothetical pen test scenario, a few demos, as mentioned there. Probably when I wrote this, I preempted issues, so hopefully the demo gods are with me, and some takeaways, and then a Q&A. So, firstly, we are not going to be pen testing Microsoft's cloud services. So what I mean there is I want to just differentiate maybe some few misconceptions. So when you think what I mean by what we're going to be doing today is we are not pen testing the Azure portal. I'm going to show a few demos of how do you go about pen testing services that have been deployed for a client. So we're not going to be looking at, let's say, how to go about finding 0 days or bug bounties for Microsoft. And this session is very high level. It's an introductory session. And finally is that Microsoft has a whole page of the rules of engagement. So just want to show that briefly. So what that looks like is something like this. And there's a whole list of what you can't. This is what is prohibited. So for example, if you have got an XP command shell, yeah, they're saying you can't exploit that, which is not ideal. But there are also a few things that you can do. You can fuzz what's within. If you have actually deployed virtual machine, you can read that in your own time. So before you get into cloud pen testing, well, for Azure specifically, I highly recommend going through the rules of engagement. You don't want your actual tenant or subscription to be banned. It can happen. It is not great. It has happened to me before. Where I've had to create a different account. I was playing around, trying to find bugs, and yeah, it wasn't great. So, what makes up Azure? So Azure is big, as mentioned. I'll say there are 3 components. You have got Azure AD. This is your identity provider, but it also helps to manage your security configuration, your conditional access policies, things for that nature. But for now, think of it as your core identity provider that you use for authentication. Then you have got that is now split with the resources in Office 365. If a business just purchased, let's say, Office 365 and Office 365 license, they will still have access to the Azure portal, but just the Azure AD component because that is the identity component of it. Then there are 2 different types of permissions. So as mentioned, the RBAC side, that is meant for resources. Then the Office 365, there's a whole different set of Azure AD roles and permissions that are there. As I said, Azure is big. This is kind of all the portals that are there for Azure, and it keeps going, which is a lot. Which is also fun if you want to start pen testing, you can get into a lot. A lot of it is Office 365, but there's also, let's say, Teams admin. You've got Microsoft Online, et cetera, et cetera. Keeps going. So that's how big, just for example, 365, you saw that portals, that is there. There's also different portals as well. Well, this one here is mostly just portal.azure.com and also for this one as well. But it's quite broad, and each one can have its different types of security principles that are there. Now, prerequisites is at a bare minimum, if you're performing an Azure pen test, you need internet. Yeah, that was me today. I should have thought about it. Okay, I should have had internet today. And then you also need Azure PowerShell. I highly recommend if you're starting out, this is one tool. Let me open up my Windows VM. Is using PowerShell ISC. So within here on the right, it'll give you all the list of commands, and you can use IntelliSense for that. Once you've installed it, it's very great. If you're used to using, let's say, AWS CLI, for me, it's a bit cumbersome of having to dash help or whatnot, or trying to see what can you use. It's just nice to have autocomplete as well. So that's what I use. Azure CLI is more or less the same as PowerShell, but it has its limitations. As previously mentioned, is that there are different realms that Azure is split. So that's why there's also an Azure AD PowerShell module as well, and Office 365 module. So if you want the whole toolkit, I highly recommend learning PowerShell or being more inclined in PowerShell than just sticking to Azure CLI. But in terms of certain attacks, you can still use Azure CLI. There was also an interesting talk that was given by somebody last year, but you can also use the actual API. And there are a lot of things that don't get picked up by Defender when you're just interacting with the API natively. But then I'll show at the end of my presentation something where doesn't actually get picked up. Well, recently by Microsoft, they added a new configuration. So for a high level, when you're pen testing, this is still kind of the fluffy, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, is when you are starting out to the pen test, is different organizations will have different setups. So for large organizations, they'll have organizational management. For AWS, you can think of that as basically AWS organizations. For here, within Azure, out of the box, it is grouped logically, as I mentioned, the management group, subscriptions, and all of that. So as a start, we won't focus on the first component, because that's a different thing that goes into, let's say, Azure policies. How are you going to actually configure that for entire estate, identifying gaps, using things like, let's say, Bloodhound or Azure Storm Spotter as well. And then, so you can forget about that for now, but it's always good to have in the back of your mind that there are gaps to think about in terms for large organizations, how they actually manage it, how can you bypass different things for policies. So you can keep that at the back of your mind. The second component, and I'll say this is one where it is very key in terms of pen testing, is within, I'll say specifically for Azure, IAM is big, especially with the drive for identity as a perimeter. Microsoft is pushing that very much so. So learning this and finding different bypasses, I'll show one as a demo if it does work. But the different types, as I mentioned, there's RBAC, there's also ABC, this is for storage accounts. There's also Azure AD, but each service sometimes has different types of permission models. But from a high level, knowing RBAC is a good foundation. And then service security configuration, know the target service. Each service will have its own security controls. So it's always good to know, go through the documentation. There's always been many instances where I've seen gaps just reading through Microsoft Docs and seen different, something that can bypass or something where they say this can happen so that they just cover themselves, typical Microsoft. And then the next part is secret management. For example, like AWS, you can use KMS, but there are different ways in Azure. There is Key Vault, how they handle secrets. Sometimes it's in environmental variables, sometimes it's in actual templates, things like that. So it's knowing, comes back to the previous thing of knowing your service and how the actually secrets can be leaked. Network exposure, that's a big one, seeing where there actually gaps. How can you leverage or see what's been identified, logging and monitoring, and finally DevOps as well. So, like since this talk is about pen testing for Azure, if you're having pen testing, you always have a scope of work. So, what's our scope of work for today? So we have this fictitious company, Javan Joshua Peter, I just named that because for today, has requested a penetration engagement for the external facing environment. The estate is hosted in Microsoft Azure. Just in timelines, I think maybe I might have 20 minutes. I'm not sure. Always pen test is always underscoped. So, and then report delivery is going to be as a Q&A session. And I will be your lead pen tester for today, and you guys will be shadowing me for this engagement. So what are we going to do for our cyber attack kill chain? So as I mentioned, this is going to be very high level, but keep the previous points that I mentioned at the back of your mind. We're going to start from recon. How can you actually do reconnaissance for an Azure and estate? Initial access, some enumeration, privilege escalation, and finally some defense evasion. Cool. Step one, recon. So from the initial diagram that I started with is that cloud is one big API, more or less, when you interact with it. There are a number of endpoints by default by Microsoft that you can just query, and it's like, okay, I'll give you this information. And we can discover this, for example, you can get the tenant ID. Tenant ID, that's basically the unique GUID for an organization. You can get a tenant name, type of authentication type, whether it's federated or managed. If, let's say, they have a connection to maybe on-premise and different domains in the estate. So the final one for the domains, you can kind of think of that like if you're doing a whois or an NS lookup. Cool. So these are the 4 endpoints that are there that you can query. Microsoft is not gonna remove them or anything. They are already there out of the box. And I just wanna show you what type of information you can get. Do quick test. We've got live. Nice. Sweet. So I'm gonna see which window I had it here, because I tried to catch them before. All right, I'll just copy and paste it quickly. So as mentioned, this is the endpoint that we can use to make the API call. So I'm just going to add that domain, assuming, so most of the time when a client registers their first instance of Azure, it'll have the domain will be on Microsoft.com before they actually change and register the domain. So you can use that as well if you're still doing some recon. But for this one here, as I already know, to save time, I'm just going to use that one. Oh, sweet. But nice error message. I'll chat about this error message. There's a demo which I have at the end. All right, cool. So what we have here is, this is actually the tenant ID for my actual environment. What it also tells me is some endpoints here to be used for Microsoft Online. I'm just trying to see from here as well. Okay, the other one you don't have to worry about it, but majority for this one, which is useful, is the tenant ID. That is actually useful information because when you are actually authenticating, for example, for this demo, which I'm going to show at the end, is, let's say if it's a service principal, you need the actual tenant ID to perform the authentication. So it's always a good point to start. The other one that you can use is this one here. I know if you're seeing the username at domain, you might think, oh, is that actually username enumeration? Not entirely. You can just put a 1, it doesn't matter. But the key thing here where it does the check is the actual domain, if I spelled everything correctly. And yes, it tells me that it is managed and it is a cloud instance for Microsoft Online. For example, this is not there. And you can see the difference. I'm just going to add whatever. And it's just going to tell me unknown. So you can enumerate, start using Microsoft endpoints. The other tool which is great for this is, just clear that. There's a tool that was developed where it's called AAD Internals. If you've used it for maybe for internal assessments, they actually extended this for Azure Active Directory. It queries some of these endpoints, but it also uses, I'm just here scrolling up to save me time so I don't have to type it. Uses some of the endpoints. So you can kind of think of this as kind of as whois it'll give me the same information. So it'll say, okay, these are the domains that are registered for this tenant, and I'm just here just formatting using this module. AD internals, it's on GitHub, you can try it out. And it'll also give me my tenant ID, which we saw before, and it'll also tell me DNS record is true, and also the necessary flags as well for DMARC, SPF as well. So it's useful for enumerating AD internals. Sweet. Now, other recon tools, which I'm not gonna run now, where you can check out is Office 365 Creeper and Office 365 Spray. These are not great if you know your client has, let's say, a P1 or P2 license. Microsoft has this thing of, if you want more security, pay more. I currently have a free license, so I can get away with a lot. But most clients might have a P1 or P2 license, and there's something where they have, what's the term called again? Not smart lockout, and also, I've forgotten the actual term, but it helps to identify brute force attacks. So this one, Office 365, I recommend if you're looking for valid emails, but the second one is quite tricky. You'll be quite loud if you actually scan in a user's estate. The second one, and as I mentioned, this is very introductory. Most clients use function apps, storage accounts. If you're coming from an AWS, function apps are kind of like Lambdas. Storage accounts, that is more or less like S3. So Microsoft, most of the time, unless you change your for functional apps and storage accounts, your domain, it'll have these common FQDNs, and you can literally, while you're doing recon, brute force this first points here for Azure websites, and you can actually enumerate, okay, what is actually exposed on the internet just based on that common FQDN here. The second one, storage accounts, is the same. For blobs, it's blobs. If it's a queue, just change queue.core tables, same thing. And you can actually enumerate that. I'll show one example here. So let's say from that point you had, oh shucks. Cool. I ran this before when I was hoping like my network wasn't, so I just cut it quickly soon. But anyway, it's a valid ping probe. It just shows that, okay, this site is valid. From here, because it uses the common FQDN, you can now start, for big organizations, if you've got now a word list, so basically from the domains, you can now just create a simple Python script and just literally append that, and you can now start checking, is there, you can now start doing your port scans. So for example, with function apps by Microsoft, by default, sometimes they come, in fact, not sometimes, they do come with FTP enabled unless you disable it. So you can even just scan that. For me, I just scanned it for this presentation because I wasn't sure how my net was going to behave. Should come back as filtered once it does. Yeah. So it's all about, just by this common FQDN, you can start pulling a lot of data from a client's estate, depending on how your recon is, and if you've got a good word list. The other one that you can do is, you can use Google. So by Google, you can do enumeration of public blob storages. So this is just by using Google syntax. So it's just saying, look for that common FQDN, and where there's something with PDF, and there you go. These are some people's blob storages. Well, they look as if they should be there. So, so that is that. A nice one, which is great, is, and I'll come there, I'll just skip one or two slides, is this site right here. So what this does is, this is kind of like a search engine, and it was by luck how I found this. I don't know how it was, but I was like, who actually created like a search engine of public buckets on the internet. And you can use this for AWS, GCP, and Azure. I just now restricted for Azure, but you can create an account and you can now just start looking, okay, which people have the public buckets on the internet, which is quite interesting and it's available. Sweet. So the other thing where for this site which we discovered, or I should have shown that, is I'm sure right now you're seeing a trend is that Microsoft out of the box, unless you configure it, you can get a lot of just data as an attacker. Is if I grab this FQDN here, I mean this URI, there is something called the default web jobs page. And why that is important, okay, I think I have the screenshot here. Why that is important is you might just think it just tells you your function app is running. But if you go through Microsoft documentation, you can think of this as web server bandit disclosure. You can then infer on the function app, the version, what type of architecture more or less might be using. Whether it is, let's say for JavaScript, they're using Node 6, I believe there are vulnerabilities for that and some CVEs. Then you can start inferring, okay, what type of architecture is there? Can I try specific CVEs on this public exposed function apps? Most of the time they're APIs, so it's juicy information for that. We've discussed that. So the next part is initial access, enum, and Prevesc. So for initial access, I'll dive this in a bit deeper. But if you're on a TAS or something like that, these are two tools that you can use, especially for phishing, which are great for Office 365 and Azure, is Evilginix and Token Tactics. And how it is within Azure, I'll just piggyback off of them because the flow is more or less the same, is Azure, when you authenticate using CLI clients, they store your session token on disk in clear text. What these tools do is this same token, even though you authenticate, is during the authentication flow, they can then capture the refresh token. I'll show you what the refresh token is slowly, and then you can use that to authenticate within a client's estate. By default, let's say if you have a free license or anything not P1 or P2, that token is valid for 365 days. So you can imagine, if you capture user's token, you've got persistence for a year until that session is expired. And the nice thing about it is also goes outside of conditional access policies if you do have that token. Or if you compromise a user's box, you can literally copy and paste this session token. So within PowerShell, that is, if you authenticate using PowerShell, it's within the token.dat file. For CLI, that is in the access tokens.json. And it's all in clear text. That's, I'll just show you now how that looks like when you decode it. Should be this one here, JSON Web Tokens. Ugh. Copy that again. Sweet. So that's basically, it carries all the user claims, tells me what's the email address. From there, the account that is used to authenticate. And you can literally just copy and paste this session token in your machine if you have compromised it, and you will have access. And what it is, this refresh token, is why this is stored on disk, is that instead of a user having to always re-authenticate to Azure, Microsoft thought it's a great idea to store this on disk, so they don't have to re-authenticate while they're doing development work. Microsoft says the fix for this is that users should log out for each of their sessions for that. Cool. Now let's look at a little bit on enumeration. So how does enumeration work within Azure? So as I mentioned, is you want to be using Azure PowerShell or CLI. It's a good starting place, mainly because for clients who have large environments, is you can create simple scripts to pull certain information from the estate instead of going through one by one. So for example, if I wanted to pull something in Nmap, I think I put it here. This is, I've already authenticated with that actual session token, hoping it's still valid. Yeah, sweet. From here, I can get the host name, put that in, just put it properly, host name. I can get the host name, put that in Nmap, do the port scan as I did before. So this is, let's say, once you're enumerating the environment. The one which we're now going to enumerate now, for example, when I initially mentioned, is you want to understand a user's IAM, if there are any gaps. So one of them is get AZ role assignment. So how it works within Azure is, let's say I want to give Ivan reader roles for my estate. So you use, say, I assign Ivan the reader role. Then there's something else that is called the role definition. The role definition defines what that reader role actually is. So when you are doing an enumeration is get easy role assignment, get the spell correctly. Might be easier just scrolling up. Cool, I did have it. Sweet. So what I'm saying is, give me the role assignments for the resource group called Pentesting, format that as a table, display name, scope, role definition. So there are two users. One has a reader role. This guy, Joshua, also has Pentesting. There's also an owner as well. So Pentesting doesn't seem like the standard Microsoft ones. Majority of the time is Microsoft has about 72 types of roles. Common ones about like 4: owner, contributor, reader. The fourth one, I think, is the user access administrator. I might be wrong, but I know the top 3. So you can now check, okay, is this actually a custom one? So you can say get AZ role custom definition, and it is custom. So what are actually custom roles? So how this is, we're going to just do a quick privilege escalation. As mentioned, there are different types of roles. This is the role definition. So within actually a role definition, you've got aspects of actions and not actions. And then basically an action is what you can do, star, wildcard. You can do everything, not actions. Even though you've got the wildcard, you can't delete any role assignments. You can't write to any role assignments. And you can't elevate, but you can do everything else. And then data action is what you can do, data plane events. So the 3 of them which are not great, where it is the role assignment right, if that is not explicitly defined within the not actions, then you can then write to any principal within the estate role definition, you can assign write actions. Role definitions, you can update any definition, and elevate, you can elevate your privileges. So I will show that briefly. I think I had that here. So basically what we saw here is that there's this pen testing role. This individual has read actions, but the role assignment right here, they can't assign to any people, but they can amend because definition is not put there as a not action. So they can actually amend this actual role definition. So what that means is, okay, where is it? Somewhere here. Save time. Okay, there we go. Cool. So just put that as a variable to just be easier to work with. And so let's see if that's the right step. So you can from here then amend. I'm going to, in fact, instead of remove, because I was doing that before, I'm just going to do add for the sake of whatever. And from here is I'm now going to update this role definition. If it's somewhere here, I'll have to type it again. And I'm just going to use the set one to say, okay, I want to update this actual role definition. Hopefully that works, and it did. And I've now updated and I say I can do anything. Inversely, I can also remove that one and say, okay, I want to assign something to somebody else. So this is one example of privilege escalation, but within an IAM context. It's always something to check out within that aspect. Now, the other thing is, if you're coming from AWS, there's also the metadata service as well within Azure. This one is a bit of a long one, so I'll just take it from the start and the end. I figured there's no way I'm going to keep typing all of it for the demo's sake. So what the metadata service is in actual virtual machines is you can, let's say if you've compromised a virtual machine, you can make a call request to the specific endpoint and it will tell you all the details about the virtual machine. So for example, here you can see Javan demo, the resource group, etc., the IP address, so on and so forth. The nice thing about this is that within Azure, it's kind of think of it as a server-side request forgery attack. Is they have this thing of managed identities where Microsoft don't want the developer storing the actual secrets, let's say environment variables, or within source code is just a good practice to store within Key Vault, and they have no viewpoint of the credentials, or they have to worry about handling the credentials. Now, if you are now assign a managed identity to this virtual machine to say, okay, I want to get a key from Key Vault, then if you compromise this actual virtual machine, you can actually now start querying this Key Vault, get a session token for the actual virtual machine, which is here. So I'm saying, I'm making a call request in the metadata service, give me the access token that I'm now going to use to query Key Vault and get the secrets. So as compared to, you can't turn this off or on, it is there. So the remediation for this is you have to lock down your actual Key Vault policies and make sure that it can just not access any other keys within actual Key Vault. Tools where you can check out is there's Azure PowerShell and Macroburst. This is kind of like Metasploit toolkit. Under the hood, it uses Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI. You don't necessarily, everything, for example, the command which is running there is within actual these tools as well. They just help you. But I always recommend learning out from first principles to understand what the tool is actually doing instead of just running them. Scout Suite by NCC, this is more for configuration and auditing. It's not that great. It doesn't pick up a lot of things, in my opinion, but it's a good starting point if you're just trying to do a blast radius. And then the final one is Bloodhound. I've played around with Bloodhound a few times. The limitation of it is that it doesn't have every service for that. So they do have app services. They recently came with managed identities, but it's quite limited with what they have from an Azure perspective. Defense evasion, this is going to be very quick. If you're using Azure PowerShell and CLI, not a lot of things get picked up. And I've been doing this for quite some time for different clients. Yeah, it doesn't pick up. They think, okay, you have, let's say, reader roles, happy, that's okay. It's not seen as something malicious. So I'm going to show one thing. Let me just re-authenticate here. So this was recently, I need to sign in. Hopefully my session is still active. Lovely. So this was recently added as a service by Microsoft. So until I think March, April, there was no way of tracking sign-in logs for service principals, so service accounts, which wasn't great. So this part here, I haven't done the request yet. So before this attack, this was something where I played around with, and I was like, oh, wait, there's actually a gap here. So how service principals are is kind of like a service account. You can give it permissions, you can give it read, owner rights. Within the Azure AD realm, it can also have permissions. So for example, if you have an Office 365 license, Outlook will have its full read all permissions for the entire estate. So there was a gap here, which is like, okay, if they're not tracking sign-in logs, there should be a way that I can brute force or just go under the radar to not be discovered. So I wrote this dirty script. Backstory was, at the time, Terraform, or before I go there, when you create a client secret, somewhere here. So there are 3 or 4 ways you can create client secrets. You can create it in the portal. You can create it through Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, and then you can also use infrastructure as code. The first 3 that I mentioned about is Microsoft will give you a secure password. And they'll be like, it's about 15, 20 characters long. If you now use Terraform, it was an older version of Terraform, developers could then assign service principals passwords. So you can imagine developers could assign maybe a weak password or something, and this would go under the radar. So that was one where it was an issue where it was there for an older version of Terraform. And I was like, let me try and see if I can brute force. But step 1, how will I be able to, is there any way that I can see user enumeration? So I created this, it's a very light script. There's these error codes by Microsoft. So what it is it'll tell you whether it's literally straight up user enumeration. It will say this ID is actually valid, but the password that you gave is incorrect. So, which is great. I'm sure we all know about user enumeration. So all this does is I was just checking to see is this password valid or not, and try and brute force service principals basically to get the permissions that they have within a client's estate. So I'm just going to run that shortly. If I can see where that script is. While I'm just doing this, are there any questions so far? Okay. Sweet. Yes. Okay, that is there. So there should be one. So this before, while that is running, there is one, is that, to come back to my point here while it's running, is that there are a lot of things within Microsoft Azure, unless if they bring up a service for it, you'll be undetected when you're interacting with Azure PowerShell or CLI. Enumerating all the different things that I did, that doesn't get picked up. For example, like when pulling the host names and all of that, it all seems fine. Microsoft currently, they're in the works of coming out with a tool within, I think, probably in the next quarter, to kind of see what type of malicious actions in terms of identities, what they're doing, and enumeration techniques. We still don't know yet when that will come. But until then, there is a lot. I'm just waiting to see if this actually picked up. Yeah, it did. There was one which worked out. So this was just something quick, few lines of code before Microsoft created a service. Would never get picked up from the radar. And to end off is, you don't learn to walk by following rules, you learn by doing and by falling over. There's still a lot I haven't covered, but I enjoy pen testing Azure. There are a lot of fun things that come out from there, and I encourage all of you to try it out. If you are interested, There are three things where I'll say I highly recommend is check out NetSpy's cloud blog posts. They give out a lot of information and useful tools. Pentest Academy, I did this boot camp. It was very, very great. They are not that much, for example, from AWS vulnerable environments. There's recently one which came out, but there's not much which is out there. And also Black Hills Information Security, their YouTube challenge is great. They have a full talk about the token tactics, all the things that I've spoken about, so the recon and the endpoints and the like. And that is all. Thank you very much.